Good morning and welcome to the October 2016 UTMB NASA Johnson Space Center Aerospace Medicine Residency Grand Rounds. We welcome those of you joining us live here in Houston, those joining from our satellite locations, and of course those who are streaming online. Members from the audience at USRA will have the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker at the end of the lecture, and so will those of you at our satellite locations. Today, I am happy to introduce a colleague, Dr. Eric Antonsen. Dr. Antonsen currently serves as the element scientist for exploration medical capabilities within the NASA Human Research Program. He is board certified in emergency medicine and has assistant professorships in the section of emergency medicine as well as the Center for Space Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine. He received his master's degree and PhD in aeronautical and astronautical engineering, where he worked for the Air Force Research Laboratory on spacecraft electric propulsion. These degrees, and later his medical degree in 2009, were all completed at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Antonsen subsequently graduated from a Harvard-affiliated emergency medicine residency program in 2013. Prior to NASA, Dr. Antonsen Dr. Antonsen provided emergency medical support for the Red Bull Stratus mission and was the field medical director for the Stratus mission, both of which were record-breaking high-altitude missions. He currently runs the Aerospace Medicine Focus in the Baylor Emergency Medicine Residency, and he mentors students for the Baylor Center for Space Medicine. He has been an instructor for the Wilderness Medicine Institute and was selected for the NIH's Fogarty International Clinic Research Scholars in Zambia in 2007 and 2008. Dr. Antonsen is a fellow of the American Academy of Emergency Medicine and the American College of Emergency Physicians. Amongst his accolades, he holds multiple publications to his name. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Antonsen.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction, Ronak. It's an honor to be here. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in NASA at the Exploration Medical Capabilities element, which is a part of the Human Research Program. For any of these talks, I often try to make sure I put up my conflicts of interest disclosure. I work both for Baylor as well as NASA on an IPA agreement, and I also have some interests in private companies. So for the moment, I'm just going to go over what are the big topics that I'm going to try to cover. And what I really want to give a sense of today is some of the challenge and the way that we look at integrating medicine into a vehicle system for an exploration mission. So I'll talk about how we define the challenge, a little bit of the history about how some of the spaceflight medical systems have developed, and then why Mars is so different. And when things are so different, we need some sort of principles for how we approach these problems. And then I'll talk about how we're working to scope a medical system and give you a little bit of context where EXMC is right now in that development process. So when we say mission to Mars, it's always been something that's been way off in the horizon, somewhere out in the future. And one of the arguments I'm going to make today is that it's actually not that far away. It's not as far as we have typically thought about it. There are things that are happening and unfolding in the way that spacecraft and vehicles are planned that mean that we need to have a lot of definition in place to be able to scar vehicles, to influence the way vehicles are designed, to make sure that medicine as a subsystem is integrated into the vehicle. And that, when you talk about the challenges of going to Mars, has implications for how we would provide medical care. If we have to define this earlier, then we have to stop thinking of it in the sense of it's somewhere over the horizon. We actually have a very short time window, in my mind, to accomplish the integration of a medical system into a vehicle when we talk about the proving ground vehicles and the things that are going to be heading to Mars. One of the challenges is we oftentimes think we can rely on what we've done in the past, and when we do that, we run the risk of not challenging the assumptions that don't actually work within the paradigm that we're talking about. And so the question about what do we do on the ISS and what did we do when we went to the moon and how applicable is it in delivering medical care is a very relevant one. Exploration medical capabilities is part of the Human Research Program, one of several elements that work to try to decrease the risks to humans in long-duration spaceflight and exploration. Within NASA, this is what we own, if you will. There are a number of risks that have been identified by the Human System Risk Board, by the Health and Medical Technical Authority, and historically, exploration medical capabilities has been responsible for this. And this is acknowledging that medical conditions will occur, that things will go wrong, and they can eventually lead to either adverse health outcomes or Just as concerning, loss of mission objectives. Even if you don't lose crew life, you can lose mission objectives. And in multi-billion-dollar missions, like something to Mars will be, that's a big deal. And then there's also the long-term health piece, which is what happens as a result of our crews flying in space in environments that we've never actually been in before. So when we think about this, EXMC sees our mission as one straightforward statement. It's not just about delivering medical care. It's about decreasing that medical risk. And we look to do that through medical system design and integrating that into the overall mission and vehicle design. That medicine is a part of the vehicle and a part of a human-centric approach to space flight. So it's useful and instructive to take a step back and look at what has been done before in terms of integrating medicine into the vehicles in prior spaceflight experience. In 2001, NASA asked the Institute of Medicine to review how it integrated medicine with the larger space program. And there were a number of challenges that were found at that time. This is Safe Passage. This is a book that was written by the Institute of Medicine as they evaluated NASA's space program and how we do medicine. And one of the things that I thought was striking about this is a statement that's part of this one. Long-duration space travel is going to require a different approach, one requiring wider participation of those with expertise in divergent, emerging, and evolving fields. And one of the focuses that I'm going to try to get to today as we go through this talk is to show how and where a lot of other disciplines are going to be interfacing with medicine as we try to look towards building the systems that will allow us to do the proving ground vehicles and to go forward to Mars. This was in 2001. It recognized that some of the early challenges in the space program were very engineering-centric challenges. Just the challenge of getting there was so overwhelming that sometimes medicine could be seen as something that could sit in the back seat, especially if you're doing a mission of a few hours, a few days, possibly a week, maybe 2 weeks. But as you get longer and longer in the time you spend in orbit, medical challenges become a much larger concern. And so looking at Project Mercury, this is out of Mike Barrett's book. These are the pictures that they have of what the medical kit looked like at that time. And they actually did some biomonitoring at that time, including skin resistance, heart rate. They did rectal temperature. It was not necessarily a fully integrated system, but it had some medical capability that was brought along. When you advance to Gemini and Apollo, you start seeing the medical kit getting a little bit larger, along with some included meds that they hadn't had before. And taking one more step, you start to look at what happened at the space shuttle. And these type of missions were a couple of weeks long. And I don't mean for you to read all this. What I mean for you to do is to start recognizing how much more was added to the system, how many more medications, how many more consumables. Because for one, there was more space for it. We had the room to actually accommodate these things. And two, there was the concern that there was a need for it. Medicine was still a kit in this domain primarily. And when you come to the International Space Station, when you look at what the Safe Passage had recommended about an integrated astronaut health system, you start to see the beginnings of that. With the check system, you have 3 different subsystems, including countermeasures, environmental health, and health maintenance. And now you're talking about missions that go from 6 months to a year. If something goes wrong on a very short duration mission, you would expect that it would be something more emergent potentially, or something that you could deal with later. If you start getting into 6 months to a year territory, then you start having longer term health concerns and some chronic maintenance issues, and the system becomes more necessary to sort of track and deal with what you're doing. But it's not completely integrated into the space station vehicle. As many of the flight surgeons here know, if you wanted to go get an EKG up until recently, you had to negotiate with the BP ECG, or you had to settle for something less than a 12 lead. Sometimes moving information around was a bigger challenge than you would otherwise think it would be, or expect if you're working in a hospital on Earth. And so this is where we are today, and when we look to the vehicles of the future, part of identifying how we want to operate is looking at what are the challenges that we have and seeing how we can improve on those. Because when this vehicle was actually created, when the first module started flying in 1998, that's actually the year that I got my very first cell phone in graduate school, and it was a flip phone. And it doesn't have any of the capability or computing power that I've got in my pocket right now with an iPhone. Right now, I could take that thing and turn on my thermostat at home from here, or open a garage door. Those types of integration are not things that were expected at the time that this system was developed. But when we look at developing a medical system for what's going to happen later, we want to make sure we're at least setting the floor for having that type of information management going forward. And so when we look at NASA's missions, this is where we're at. We are trying to get to Mars, and there's a number of steps that happen in between. For 15 years, we've been operating and optimizing the way we've operated in low Earth orbit in the space station domain. And the next step, the one that's on the horizon, is in the mid-2020s looking at putting a habitat around the moon that we're calling the Proving Ground Vehicle. This is where we plan to test and demonstrate all the technologies and capabilities that we think we're going to need, many besides medical, in order to go and do this Mars mission. Now this may be a little bit longer of a time frame than what Elon Musk is talking about, but I think it's a well-considered time frame, especially given the number of challenges that we have in place that we have to address before we do this. So what I'm really going to be talking about is how do we actually provide something to the proving ground that helps demonstrate our ability to do medicine in this new paradigm. And so let's talk about that paradigm for a moment. What about Mars? If we've looked at some of the other spaceflight experiences that we've had, this one is something that is completely out of our realm of experience. Stole these unashamedly from Stan Love just to set the stage for this, right? That little blue dot where it says Earth at start, what I want you to keep in mind as you look at these things is that all of human history has happened within that little blue dot on this scale. And that includes the moon missions because we're so far out. So everything that's ever been done in human history has happened within that little blue dot there, and that's where we're starting. And it takes us 9 months to get out to where Mars is using a Hohmann transfer, which is the minimum energy orbit. Then we stay there for about 16 months, doing science on the surface and hopefully surviving, and looking at a return trip that takes about 9 months to get back. We're no longer in the domain of what we did with the moon, which took us about 3.5 days to get out there and about a week total to complete our mission and get guys back. And during that whole process, what the vehicle is that goes out there really has only a couple of goals. One is to keep the crew safe. 2 is to make sure they can get to Mars safely, meet mission objectives, and make sure they can come home from Mars safely. Those 3 things really are what this all boils down to, and all those little letters over on the side there are different parts of the Johnson Space Center that are contributing different portions to this through the Human Research Program and other areas in terms of how do you create a health and human performance system that allows you to meet mission objectives and keep the crew safe. So, pointing that out, I refer back to Thomas Kuhn in 1962. We've all heard the term paradigm shift. That term actually became part of the parlance of our times in 1962 as a result of his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this is what he says: all is well until the methods legitimated by the paradigm, that's the current way of operating, cannot cope with a cluster of anomalies. Crisis results and persists until a new achievement redirects research and serves as a new paradigm. He was using it in a local sense, and then everybody and their mother took it and ran with it and applied it to everything out there. So it becomes sort of an overborne way of talking about changing the way we look at things. But I think it really applies here because there's a number of anomalies that I'd like to point out that really don't apply in the way we do medicine right now. The first one is no real-time communications. And this raises a whole host of questions about how we actually put together our protocols and how we change the way we're operating in space. Because as of today, most crews have a ongoing, kind of constant communication with ground support in real time. Even when we do ultrasound up on the station, it is under real-time guidance from the experts that are here at JSC, like a shot. So all of these questions start coming up. How do you change the way that we're doing business up there? And how do you actually create crew autonomy in doing medicine without training the entire crew to go through all of medical school and all of the requirements that they need to do that we typically think of terrestrially to provide medicine? So that's one thing. Another thing is we can't resupply any materials. We could maybe pre-position them, but now you're talking about, especially in the domain of drugs that are expiring, medications expiring, or consumables that might expire, now you're talking about longer time frames until that they have to endure until they might get used. So we can't actually resupply materials in the orbital mechanics that we have to deal with. And this, for those taking mock, may or may not be related to pharmaceuticals and medical consumables being two of the biggest, hardest hit things by this. Right now we have the up mass on the station to be able to deal with getting these things up there. And then there's no potential for any evacuation if you have something serious happen in terms of an injury or an illness. One of probably the closest examples to that was Fred Hayes on Apollo 13, who probably was septic, many people think, but on his way home. And so if he had not made it home, it wouldn't have been an issue. He made it home. It became something that he could be treated for once he actually got back to Earth. When we take this away, it changes the way we have to think about doing medicine on these missions, including all of these questions that you see here. And how do we decide on what to bring and not bring when we can't bring everything in the kitchen sink to deal with the most distressing things that a crew may have to deal with? So these are the anomalies that sort of point towards the need for that type of paradigm shift in the way we address this. And if you're going to start addressing something that's outside the realm of our experience, it's useful to try to identify what are some principles of approach or some fundamentals that you can apply to approaching the problem. So back to safe passage for just a moment. A couple of the different conclusions they came up with. At that time, and this was 2001, NASA's made a lot of strides since then in terms of the way that we deal with humans in the system. But I think there's also more that we can do. They said there's no comprehensive and inclusive strategy to provide optimum health care for astronauts in support of long-duration missions beyond low Earth orbit, nor is there sufficient coordination of health care needs with the engineering aspects of these missions. So integrating the medical needs, the health care needs with how we actually engineer the vehicle and provide a system is something that was identified in 2001 as a big challenge. This is human-centric engineering. This is how do you have the vehicle actually take care of the people who are in it rather than just be something that they're being transported in. And it's a constantly evolving process for NASA. So there's a couple of parts to this. When we think about medicine and what do you want to provide medicine-wise on a mission, you're really asking the question, or the physicians are asking the question of, what do we actually need to provide care? The engineers then set up and they say, well, you've got this much room, volume, mass, power, data transmission capability, so we'll tell you what we think is possible. And out of that, you'll end up with the system. If you apply this to modern day operations in the International Space Station and say you want something different, you go and haggle with the engineers or people about upmass and how to integrate it into the already existing system. There's a third part of this, though, and that third part of this is where the Human Research Program at NASA really comes in. And that is, well, if we have a time frame ahead of us of about 10 years or even longer, how can we get more of what we need integrated or packaged or shrunk down or using less power into that system? And that's what research is really all about. And this is why EXMC tries to integrate both with the flight surgeons and the space medicine operations community as well as all the engineering groups to try to help broker that agreement and push some of that technology forward that'll help enable these missions. And that's what you end up with, is you have three legs to this stool, essentially. So what are those fundamental concept drivers then? Anytime you say we don't know how to do something in the current operations, it's an opportunity within the Human Research Program to say, okay, let's go figure out how to answer that question. There's three main drivers for this, in my opinion. One is developing a concept of operations. This is the user experience of the system as I have it up there, but what this really is actually making a plan that says this is how we imagine or envision doing medicine in this place that we've never been before. If you try to do this without having a plan, you can't actually scope an engineering system. You can't create a schedule. You can't actually define what you need. So starting at that point is one of the biggest things that EXMC is trying to do. The second thing is being able to assess and trade capabilities quantitatively in the risk space. And there's several tools we'll talk about in a moment that help us do that. But this is asking the question, well, how do we prioritize the medical capabilities that we really want the crew to be able to perform if they need to? And then the third thing is overall system design. In order to handle information or to be able to provide capability, up-to-date training, all of the sorts of things that you might want to do in a system, you actually have to scope and create that system, which is no small task. And that includes both the central data architecture for handling information, as well as medical appliances or hardware that you'd want to build and bring, and then finally the vehicle integration, which is a very big challenge. There's two other things that I've got at the bottom of the list. One is programmatics, and the other is ethics. Programmatics, it talks about actually identifying a workable target that you can design to that helps everybody to collapse their vision down into what's needed to actually meet this operational goal. And if you don't have that, then you continue to live in that domain of exploration is somewhere in the future, and somebody will get there someday. And the ethics. How do we decide what to care and where to draw that, what to carry and where to draw that red line in the sand about saying we will treat this or we will go to this level and no further because the use of resources for one crew member may endanger the rest of the mission and the rest of the crew. Some of the decisions we'll make will increase risk regardless of what we do. And we have to have an ethical way to go about doing that. So if we talk for a moment about the concept of operations, you can think about it, we break it down into both the phases of flight, transit out there, the planetary operations, EVA, launch, landing, those sort of things. But for each of those time frames, you have two basic categories. One are what are planned medical events, and these are very similar to what we do on the ISS today. Things like private medical conferences or self-exams or psychiatric conferences, things like that where you actually get to monitor what's happening in the medical space and domain. The other category is unplanned medical events, and this one's much harder to plan for because, well, it's unplanned. We don't know what's going to happen, and so we take our best guess to some extent, and we try to make it as quantitative as possible. That can be broken into several categories, especially when you're talking about crew autonomy. Self-care. If you think about what happens when you get a normal run-of-the-mill headache at home, you probably go to the store and get some naproxen or some Tylenol or something, and you just treat yourself and you don't worry about it. It's not till it rises to a level that you get more concerned about that you're going to go approach a doctor or somebody else to help intervene in your care. And that would be what we call CMO-directed care. The crew medical officer can actually guide the treatment, but doesn't necessarily have to get involved in everything. And then there's a third category, which is called emergency care. And this is when something goes horribly wrong. And oftentimes this is what people actually sort of ascribe to exploration medicine is how do we deal with the emergencies and the things that are the worst things happening. Realize we are as concerned with ongoing health maintenance and keeping things from happening and keeping our crew operating because the mission objectives are such a critical part of this whole equation. So when we talk about it from the medical side, we go back to that question, what do you need? And a medical doctor looks at this and they say, well, I need these abilities, the ability to do prevention and screening, the ability to diagnose something that's going wrong, the ability to treat something. Maybe I need some rehabilitation capability in flight. Maybe I need to have chronic management of something. And the ability to prognose, to tell somebody what you think is going to happen and where the arc of the injury or illness is going. Those are the type of things that the medical community thinks about. And in order to actually integrate those into a vehicle system, there's a number of steps that you have to take. You have to identify what you think are the most likely things that are going to happen so that you can actually scope a realistic system. You also have to identify the needs that you have to address those things that are going to happen, which is if you have somebody get appendicitis, what do you need to diagnose it? What do you need to treat it, right? That's where you start making your list of stuff to bring. You need a medical system that's going to optimize the crew response to those risks. And when I say a medical system, I'm not talking about HAL 9000. I'm talking about a system that is at least as useful as what residents and physicians use in the hospital every day today, which is being able to look on up-to-date to help jog their memory or access pharmaceutical databases to find out what the right dose is. Things that are like knowledge support as well as guidance and just-in-time teaching. My residents go to the New England Journal of Medicine webpage to look up how to do an IND if they've never done it before so that they're prepped for it. And then I can walk them through it afterwards. So access to those type of things are fundamental today in the way we practice medicine. But beyond that, and this is where you get a lot more of the engineering flavor starting to get involved, you actually have to test out the system that you create. And once you get through that testing, you actually have to be able to implement that into a vehicle. And that's part of a larger process that we as doctors are not necessarily always familiar with. So we'll talk about quantifying medical risk for a minute. If you've watched DXMC over the past couple of years, you probably could make the mistake that mainly what we do is the integrated medical model. And this is where that fits. This is quantifying that medical risk. But it's not the only thing that goes on within the element. When we talk about what do we have to deal with, this is one of our tools. This is the Exploration Medical Conditions List. It's 100 conditions, 47 of which have happened in spaceflight before, and 53 of which have not. But if they did, we think it would be a bad day or something that we should be planning for. This was in place before I started this job as EXMC element scientist. There's a lot of work and thought that's gone into this. And it helps inform the risk tools that we actually try to use to bring quantitative assessment to the way that we characterize risk. It covers a lot of different areas. And when you think about the training that you would need to be able to address all these different things, it's a pretty general list. The way that NASA thinks about risk is they take at least those 100 medical events and they say, okay, well, now we know what we're dealing with. Well, maybe not, because there's all these other things that you get to have while being human that we may not have planned for. And it's that combination of those things that really make up the medical risk. The problem that we have is that we don't know how big that bottom box is. So we can't necessarily always quantify things in the way that people would like, which is likelihood and consequence, because you can't rack and stack everything that could ever happen. So we approach things in the context of medical capability. The tools that we use for that are three things. One is the exploration medical condition list, which I just showed you, those 100 conditions that we have of interest right now. The second one is the integrated medical model, which is something that really explores the event space. What is likely to happen, what can happen, and how often will it happen? And the third is something that we call MONSTER, which is something that explores the call space. If you were a physician who was facing this thing that's happening, what would you really like to have in your tool bag in order to diagnose, treat, deal with it in some way? And that's what those are. So the integrated medical model, I promise I'm only going to put one slide up about this. It's a black box, sort of, not really. But it allows you to take those information from those conditions as well as a bunch of other information that really affects what is going to happen or what happens in a medical scenario. The number of EVAs, for example, affects your exposure to the possibility of getting decompression sickness. It affects how much fingernail delamination you have, things like that in our experience in space flight. Size and gender of the crew, the mission duration, all of these things are variables that have to be factored in order to get out quantified outputs. And those are output right now as the likelihood of meeting an evacuation criteria, the likelihood of a loss of a crew life, or quality time loss, which is called the crew health index in the model. It also pulls out the type of medical events, the number of medical events, the resources used, and so for planning for the space station or for things that are occurring right now, it actually can be a very useful tool to help you balance or give you a starting place for how do you actually plan for this. And once you have an idea in place of what you'd like within your medical kit, you can go back to it and say, if I change these things, how does it change my posture, my risk posture for that stuff? And so that's what the IMM is. It's a chance to explore that event space. What do we think is going to happen and how often do we think it's going to happen? And in the context of the ISS at least, or near-term things, how can we decrement resources and expect to plan for that stuff? The next thing is MONSTER. And MONSTER and IMM both could take entire talks themselves, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth in how this sort of stuff is actually developed in the algorithms, but MONSTER is an attempt to look at, from a physician's point of view, if I had a condition that I had to deal with, what would I need to have with me in order to diagnose it, and what would I need to have to treat it? It's been an experimental thing that we put together to try to explore that call space. What would a physician call upon? And so as an example, what I'm putting up here is the list of medication classes that has come out of the most recent version of MONSTER and how important they are relative to one another for a Mars DRM. So what I'm talking about there is disregard the gray lines and the call numbers for a moment. Look at the blue lines up there. When we look at a Mars DRM, we're bringing in the probability of occurrence of any of those 100 conditions from IMM, from the IMED database. And we're balancing that with how critical physicians, in this case 7 different board-certified physicians have weighed into this so far, how critical those things would be to treat the different conditions that would come up. It's integrating over all of those conditions, not just looking at one at a time. And when you do that, you get an ability to repeatably weigh the value of these things one against the other. There are challenges here. This is a starting place like IMM, not an ending place. Same thing with lab analysis, for example. How important or how often would you call on these sort of things if you were dealing with these from an Earth-based perspective? And the reason why I say from an Earth-based perspective is because in the research domain we have the capability to go out and say if something is really important, then we can invest in trying to make that smaller, more portable, more applicable to our space-based challenges. And so it's a starting place for discussion when we talk about what do we think is really important. And it's a starting place to get clinicians all on the same page and then trim that list from there. All right, I'm going to step away from quantifying medical risk and look at what does it actually take to scope a system out. So when we talk about envisioning doing medicine, we talk about the planned operations, the unplanned operations, there's human performance involved, and there's research needs. And all of those things have to be accommodated in a system that you would like to provide to do this. When we talk about how we value and prioritize medical capability, we're talking about what's that event space, what's that call space, and how do we prioritize the capability to invest our research dollars to make our future missions more successful. When we get to where we are now, we talk about how do we actually create the system that supports all of this? And that's information handling, that's command and control, that's system vehicle and ground vehicle interfacing, that's a whole different thing. Those first two we've already talked about a little bit, the concept of operations and the ability to trade risk in the quantified space. So when we get to the system, it's a little bit of a different story. We think that a medical system is judged by its ability to provide a crew fit for duty when called. That is the main point for us at NASA in our estimation, because we're talking about achieving mission objectives that have been set. We're not going to Mars to do medicine. So we don't want this system to explode and be huge. If we think about it from the point of view of phases of flight, there's transit phases there and back, there's the planetary phase, there's EVAs. All of the information for clinical care, for operational needs, occupational surveillance that goes on right now, and then the research that we're doing to inform future missions all has to be handled. And on the vehicle, it gets handled through the implementation of some system that manages, stores, and processes that information for crew, potentially in real time. But that also has to be mirrored and understood back on Earth for situation awareness and support from mission control, which is what happens today, but with some of the different challenges in the Mars domain. Those things have to talk to each other. So now we're getting system complexity is getting pretty high. Real-time data processing for a crew to help inform them for what's going on in the medical domain on their mission. Occupational health and mission support for what's happening in the ground. Two systems that have to be one system and linked through the telemetry that's available for that mission. So what do you want to include on that system on the vehicle? Well, there's a lot of different things. For example, sensors, biosensors, EVA sensors, exercise sensors, environmental sensors. We also want to do tracking. We're trying to figure out how much consumables we're using, what medications are we using. What is our risk posture because we're running out of things like that. Medical equipment like your ultrasound, any of the devices you're doing for imaging, EKG, all that sort of stuff. Reference tables or knowledge augmentation that I was mentioning earlier, like farm databases, hazmat databases. That information needs to be at your fingertips to at least give the capability that we have within hospitals today. And then models that look at guiding or understanding our risk posture, what's going on with the human physiology. Some of those things are part of data streaming, and some of those things are part of intelligence augmentation for a mission, but all of them get processed through a central domain, something that we call the medical data architecture, which is a middleware software development process that then helps you on the output side of this equation, which is monitoring the behavioral needs and the exercise needs for the crew, for example, because if somebody stops working out or stops being able to function at that level, it may trigger whether you want to have a crew medical officer ask a question. Being able to do the training, just-in-time training or skills refreshers that are needed to be able to provide medical care. Tying into the electronic medical records or to assisted medical procedures. Interfaces that ultimately lead you to a place where you can have some level of medical decision support, whether that's in a telemedicine domain or in a fully autonomous domain. This is just capturing the things that you need. This says nothing about the relationships or the interfaces. So when we talk about the programmatics of actually making something like that, now you need a time frame, a schedule, and some way to actually focus it. So you have to make hard decisions. This is not sometime in the distant future. And this is the time frame that we're talking about. 2025 is really where we're looking at fielding the start of that proving ground vehicle. As with many things NASA, of course it could slip, but we must plan to the dates that are currently on the books. And therefore, we really have about 9 years, a little bit less, to scope build, and integrate this system and show that it is an operable way of actually being part of the vehicle. Remember, ISS is coming to an end. Right now, 2020, maybe 2024, who knows? Maybe we get 2028. I don't actually know. But our ability to actually use ISS to scope and to demonstrate these capabilities will be ending. And it's also been harder for any of the research elements to get stuff up there because of cuts in crew time availability for what we're doing. All right, so where are we now? EXMC work on this system gets decomposed into several different domains. There's the operational needs, the information resources, technology, and hardware. Operational is thinking about how do we actually imagine doing medicine. It's that concept of operations. It is how do you create a safe and effective pharmacy. It is how do you make ethical decisions about what you're including. These are all things that touch on the operational domain. The information resources is the handling of all that information and data that we've talked about, command and control of medical devices, for example. And then the technology and the hardware is the devices themselves, things like an ultrasound or an EKG or an oxygen concentrator or whatever it is that you think you need in the system. And the research ties into all those needs through this paradigm. This is our research gaps. You don't need to read all of them. They basically break down like this. Those ones tie into those operational, how do we do things? These ones tie into how do we manage the information that we're dealing with? And these ones tie into how do we create the hardware that augments and allows the implementation of medical care. So our current status, we changed our research pathway in 2015 to this paradigm, which is actually targeting how do we create and demonstrate a system that is implementable on a vehicle that can scar a vehicle that's currently in development. By scar, I mean inform the engineers of what medicine's requirements are for that vehicle, not wait for them to come to us and say, you have this much space and this much power, and you can put all your things in that corner until we need them. IMM, that quantitative tool that we talked about briefly, is finishing an external review. It's being evaluated by people outside of the groups that have actually been doing the development of it, and that will be hopefully transitioning to operations completely in the coming year. Monster, which is that other risk quantification tool, our second phase of development of that has been completed, which gives us those charts that you got to see, and we're evaluating how useful those are and how we can modify that system to actually be more useful to exploring that call space. It's still an experimental product. Our concept of operations has already started, and we expect in February to have the Mars Transit concept of operations. And many of you who are flight surgeons have been pulled on for your knowledge and expertise to help us formulate and inform that. We have a pharmacy research plan. Pharmacy has been an area that has had its own specific challenges in the past because of personnel issues. One of our experts was actually died a year ago from a stroke. So we've had some delays in the way that we work on the pharmacy plan. But we expect to present that to the Science Management Panel for the Human Research Program in November. And we do have ongoing research, some of it I'll touch on in a minute, that goes to how do we provide a safe and effective pharmacy in these type of contexts. The medical data architecture, that system that's right at the center of that, is underway, and I'll show you a little bit of a map of what that looks like. Medical device projects, and there's a whole bunch of these. When people have thought of EXMC in the past, they've oftentimes thought of individual single-point solutions to individual medical problems. All of those devices need to be part of this larger medical system and to seamlessly move information from those devices back and forth between the electronic medical record or the multilateral medical repository and the devices themselves so that you're not wasting crew time and skills doing that. And then the last two at the bottom are something that really speak to the complexity of this whole thing. The role of physicians, the role of nurses and pharmacists and all of the clinical staff that's involved in planning for this is really about telling the system designers what do we need to be able to implement medical care and whether or not the rock that they bring forward to evaluate is useful. And so a clinician's working group has been established to try to give that feedback. Most recently, we had the exploration lab analysis come to that group, and a lot of great help and input from flight surgeons and other people who are involved in providing care today. And then the last thing, which is really critical, is the systems engineering and, I meant not operations, actually it's a typo, systems engineering and integration group. So our SE&I group is what is a formal way to go about addressing identifying interfaces and managing the interfaces in this complex system, both between the parts of the system as well as the vehicle in the system. And one of the big challenges that I see in the medical community is that sometimes people look at that as like sort of accounting or administrative overhead. It's not. It is its own discipline of engineering, and I'll show you a quick example of that. I don't want you to actually read this whole thing. This slide is actually a map that the group out at Ames Research Center has developed for creating that medical data architecture. And the main things that you need to take away from this is that the amount of expertise and the amount of investment in creating how you generate, move, and ingest data on a vehicle is a supremely challenging process in engineering. So when the safe passage comments that said we're going to have to draw from lots of other areas for how we, of expertise and divergent areas, this is one of them. This is a masterpiece in software engineering that looks at being able to agnostically take devices off the market so they can interface with a central processing place and put them out into a user interface and visualization. Handle, store, process, be able to create an opportunity for any of those devices to talk to each other as well as the electronic medical records back home. That's the main thing to take away from this. It's hugely complicated. Not only for the vehicle, which is what you just saw, but also for the ground. And this is something called Impala, which is a data analytics platform that the Crew Health and Safety group is already investing in. It's about where do we store the data that we're gathering, and how do you enrich the data so that you actually tie it to the other things of relevance and you can draw conclusions from it. So far, they are integrating LSAH, the Multilateral Medical Repository, the electronic medical records into this data reservoir and analytics platform on the ground. Other things will be coming in the future. And this is a tie-in between how space medicine operations and the human research program interface with each other, because the human research program draws a huge amount of data out of the occupational health data collection that goes on to try to understand what's happening. The vehicle needs to interface with this, and we work to try to make sure that those two development processes are aligned in parallel. Specific appliances, and this is what I think people have often thought of EXMC as, is some of the appliances that we try to develop. In the context of the larger system, this can almost come as an afterthought, but it's not. Here's some things that we've been working on. The flexible ultrasound system up at the top. NSBRI has spent a lot of money investing into how do you actually diagnose kidney stones, for example, with the ultrasound, new techniques to do that, as well as they've demonstrated the ability to push stones that are inside of a kidney just using that same ultrasound transducer over the skin. And the next steps, things they've already proven in the laboratory, are the ability to break stones with that same ultrasound transducer. It was the investment in that flexible system allowing users to write code and change the energy deposition, the oscillation frequencies, and those things that allowed those advances to be possible. It's also being used to look at and accelerate bone healing if you have a fracture. And there's a decent amount of work that's going on there that's very promising. RTA, we call it a real-time analyzer. It's a Raman spectroscopic device that actually measures the degradation of pharmaceuticals non-invasively. You put a little pill in, you shine a laser on it, and you get the breakdown of what the active pharmaceutical ingredient is, and in many cases what those first degradants are. So a crew that has medications that could be degrading over time can look at it and intelligently say, well, this one is one that I shouldn't take, because this toxic analyte a toxic degradant has formed inside of it. Or this is one that it's probably not going to hurt me, but it's not going to help me either, so maybe I won't use that one. Dose tracker is flying on the station right now. It's a software package that tracks pharmaceutical usage, side effects, efficacy. Believe it or not, we don't have a great handle on what is used, how often, when, and whether the crew thinks it works. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to research and understand. The medical consumables tracker was blown up on SpaceX when it blew up the last time, so we're resending it up on something else, but this is an RFID device to help us inform what's being used, because if we're going to create a safe and effective pharmacy, we need to know what it is that's actually being used, how much, and what we really want on the long duration missions. The EKG Cardiacs device was delivered to the space station recently. This is a device that basically uses a small glove, a glove that you can pull off electrodes on, is disposable, and the box that it's attached to allows for streaming of that EKG down to the surface or into a different computer. And then we also invest in laboratory analysis devices for exploration lab analysis, which is a project within EXMC. We've got a couple of companies that are funded right now looking at how can we decrease the amount of blood usage for the labs that we need, or how can we actually decrease the mass and volume for some of the laboratory devices that we would like to have in our exploration mission. So all of these sort of things are things that are happening right now at EXMC. And when you talk about the system as a whole, as well as those individual appliances, you start ending up with needing a testing pathway for V&V, verification and validation. And we plan to do a number of things. Testbed 1 is on the books for next year. Testbed 2 is for a year after that. A number of capabilities get integrated and demonstrated as we go through this testbed roadmap. This is all about engineering. How do you prove that the system is working? And as we bring those test beds forward, we're going to be asking for flight surgeons and other people with a background in medicine to help us evaluate whether or not this system is doing what we need it to do. Because as we're building it, we can make the improvements we need to make. Last thing that I'm going to throw up here that you shouldn't really try to read all of. This is a systems engineering diagram. This is an example of why this gets so complex and why we need so much help in the system engineering domain. The big blue box in the upper left is really the vehicle. The green in the bottom is the ground, and the gray ones on the side here are the crew. And you're starting to see all the interfaces with all of the other vehicle subsystems, as well as places that we interface with other medically related things. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And having a systematic and disciplined approach to this is one of those areas where we, as a medical community, need to interface with experts in other areas to figure out how you do this to make something like this work. So, when you do the testing of that type of system, we have basically 3 steps. Benchtop, looking at getting it to work in a basic setting, integrated system, adding the appliances in, and then getting it out into an analog and having somebody beat on it in a real-world scenario. Medical appliances happen there. IPAS is actually a Johnson facility in the engineering domain called Integrated Power and Avionics Systems, which helps because they are actually geared towards identifying and mandating the flight requirements for the vehicles for the proving ground domain. And then things like Hestia, Hera, and Aquarius are places where this can be tested in an analog environment. But each of those steps, you're going to find something that's wrong with that. And each of those steps, you have to go back and iterate on what it is that you messed up and make the system better. That's all internal to NASA, all in our process to try to get to the proving ground vehicle. But there are external processes that you'd like to have in place too, like smart pods that are deployed in Africa, or the DoD arrangements that we have with the Institute of Surgical Research, possibly Antarctica as an area where you don't have it in your own system. You have somebody else trying to use it and telling you, hey, this works, or you know what, this sucks, fix it. And so that whole process is its own branch of engineering, testing. So to summarize that, when we look at EXMC overall, we're really looking at what is a risk mitigation strategy for crews in the future. And I think about medicine and performance as being on a spectrum. When things work in your vehicle human system for exploration medicine, you perform. You have a crew performing. When things don't work, you end up in the medical domain. Whether that is the food system, whether that is the exercise system, whether that is the behavioral health system, any of those things, if they fail, you're in a place where you need to fix it and get them back to performance. And that's how I think about that process. So when we are trying to talk about risk mitigation, we're trying to get everything up towards the top of that thing. That includes the planning, the concept of operations, that includes being able to quantify risk and talk about it in a numerical way with our engineering counterparts. That includes active risk reduction, which is creating that system and building into the system the things that will support a crew doing medicine. And then those other parts that we sort of, as physicians, sometimes assume are easy to do or will get done, which is the engineering testing pathway for that, showing that it works, and the integration of that with the vehicle designers and ECLIS. Because those are non-trivial challenges. And every step of the way, the engineering teams, the research teams need to be coupled with the physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and medical personnel who envision and who have to provide that care in the operational domain. So I think that's where I'm going to stop today. Did I do okay on time? Okay, great. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
We'll go to the off-site locations. Anybody have any questions there? Okay, bring it inside. Anybody have any questions?
I actually hear the crickets.
Well, then I'll ask a straightforward question here. What do you feel is the difference between what NASA and XMC is doing in its endeavors to reach Mars versus the speed at which, say, private companies are going? Do you see any differences there?
I think that there's one obvious difference, and that NASA does this from a place of experience. And because of the experiences that NASA has had, they recognize that there's a lot of potential pitfalls as you're trying to create a new system or do something that's never been done before. I think that there's a lot of push out in the private world to try to move as quickly as possible to meet the goals that somebody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or these other guys have put together. And for one, I think it's a great thing, and I support it, and I really want to see them succeed. There is probably some balance between how NASA approaches things and how they approach things in terms of how do we actually address that risk. I think that one of the things that NASA has never said is they want to send people on a one-way trip. We've always said we'd like to get them back. I see that as a positive. I understand where the private industry is coming from with that, but for the purposes of what we're doing at EXMC, that's a pretty big deal. You can kind of launch anything anywhere in the solar system on a one-way trip. To me, a larger challenge and one that's harder to do, and what justifies the investment in an integrated medical system with the vehicle and that sort of advance is the challenge of not just getting somebody there, but also getting them home intact after that amount of time in an environment that we've never existed in before. So I am all for them doing everything that I think that they are planning to do, and I really hope that they are successful with that. But I think there's room in our solar system for all of these visions. Jen?
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciated the comprehensive thought that went behind it, and obviously a lot of complexity. I think maybe folks don't, consider when they get into the weeds of a given medical condition or a few medical conditions. So what do you think is, given all the aspects that you put out there, is the biggest rate limiting factor or your biggest constraint that we're going to have to work harder on or get a head start on, even though it might be a little later in your phase?
I think that the biggest rate limiting factor is actually going to be the software middleware, the medical data architecture that we're putting together, and that's part of why we started that as soon as we recognized that we needed it, and before the concepts of operations were even done, because that scaffolding that allows a system to be built and process the information is something that's going to take a very long time, not just to create, but also to test and integrate into the vehicle. It's going to be the main driver for how the medical system scars the vehicle. And if we think about it today, when most of us who are practicing medicine in a hospital, a huge amount of what we're doing is information management and decision making. Processing, coming up with a differential diagnosis, trying to understand what the actual problem is so that the interventions that you put into place are not something that do more harm than good. And that testing pathway is something that's going to take a long time to stand up. And the data architecture itself is something that's going to take a long time to stand up. And people have asked, why don't we take some of these things off the shelf, like Epic or something like that? And for anybody who hasn't used Epic, it's an electronic medical records system that's really designed not to provide medical care, but to provide hospitals with a way to capture all of the billing they can do for Medicare and for other insurers. And so I think that there's a big challenge in terms of us having a little bit more purity of goal in our needs to be able to create something that actually meets the needs of a medical system and accrue medical needs, rather than largely being geared towards insurance or billing needs. So that's the long pole in the tent in my mind. I think we've got a head start on quantitative risk analysis with the integrated medical model that's been in development for a long time and has shown a lot of different ways to be useful. That concept of operations and actually having that imagination of how we provide medicine is the other long pole in the tent, which when you have that, it allows you to start deconstructing the planned and unplanned events to scope what you need, and then from there it's a trade space analysis. I think it's on. Yeah.
I guess we have to speculate. Much of what I'm going to yell loud.
Just give them yours.
So people can hear you.
Okay.
There you
we
go.
I guess I'm asking you to speculate here. Much of your discussion today was oriented towards specific problems that might occur in space and how you prepare to deal with them. But you did allude somewhat to the fact that we're going to be surprised at some point. How do you prepare for the possibility of something really unexpected happening? You know, people, astronauts' hair turns green, or their teeth start to itch, or something like that. How do you prepare to deal with something like that?
Yeah, so falling into that we're not planning for it box that I showed earlier, what about the thing that really surprises us? And I think that comes in two ways. One is the flavor of it surprises us, but it doesn't seem to be that detrimental. And I think that you might be able to make a case that VIP has become that this is something that surprised us as we were expanding in our exploration. And over time, we were concerned, how dangerous is this? To date, I'm not sure of any other actual interventions clinically that you would do for that other than giving somebody eyeglasses, right? But we do worry about the long-term health effects. So there's things that are actually detrimental and things that are not. The detrimental ones fall into the emergency category. And I think that in order to address that type of thing, you need a couple of guidelines in place ahead of time. And when I say guidelines, what I mean is something like, okay, we plan to expand to give the most medical flexible capability that we can. That's why we try to integrate over all those 100 conditions to identify the resources and the skill sets that can address as many of them as possible simultaneously, right? But at some point you run into something that maybe you can't deal with, either because you haven't brought the right things or because you don't have enough resources for them. And so one of the things that we've kicked around within the concept of operations is the idea of a reassessment hard stop. So if you have crew autonomy, that medical officer is going to make the decision on how much to do, how early, and how many resources to use. And if you put into place hey, at 24 hours, if you've done everything that you can, you need to stop and reassess what the arc of this disease or condition is, and then compare that to the resources you have available and assess what your needs for the future or the rest of the mission might be for the rest of the crew. It at least gives us a time frame to stop and try to catch your breath and say, we're not going to use up all our resources right away if something emergent happens. Now, if you're in the category of something that is not that concerning, or it turns out to not be that concerning, but it's surprising, then the goal of the medical system is to be able to record as much information about that as possible. That's why research, I keep naming research as one of those things that's got to be handled by that information system, because part of our goal is to make sure we inform future spaceflight. And so if we make sure that we have adequately provided a way to capture information and get it back to the ground to do more analysis and be able to monitor over time, I think that's the best we do for something that's surprising and not dangerous.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Antonsen for coming by this morning, giving us this very enlightening talk. And for those of you that are in the room, I'm sure you'll hang around a little bit longer to answer some more questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you.